Hi, everyone, and welcome to a new session with Code with Sally. We finished the beginner series, like the topics I had in my mind for the beginner series. So if anyone missed the beginner series and they want to go through it, you will find it on YouTube channel. You'll find a playlist for the beginner series. It's sorted by oldest to newest, so you can go through it. It would be useful. We went through the basics, and if you have any time, any questions, let me know, and I will do my best whether to answer it during the session or in a recording video or one-on-one if needed as well. Today, we are talking about Apex invocation types. And the reason why I'm saying it's continue because we touched base upon this topic when we were talking about the beginner series. So I started a new playlist on my channel for the Apex invocation Salesforce, and I added to it the two sessions we had during our beginner series. In case anyone is not interested in the other topics of the beginner series and you are just watching the session from today. So those are related to what we'll be talking about. And I will go through briefly what we discussed in both of them as a summary before jumping to the new topic. So Apex invocation is a big topic and it's very important and it's very useful to learn it and to be able to understand it and use it as much as you can because it's useful. And the reason for that, because we learn together most of the time when we're using developer console in the beginner series, but that's not the case when you are working in real-time project. In real projects, you have to write Apex, but you have to invoke the Apex from different spots. Like when we discussed in the beginners, we discussed, for example, triggers. Like that's a type of automation when you insert a record or before it's inserted or update or delete. Undelete, we were doing certain actions and we learned together how to write the trigger and how to write the trigger handler. So today we'll continue this topic together. And you saw in the beginner series this slide, and we went through it together. I just did some renovation kind of to this slide, and I will go through it together today. So what we covered in the beginner series was mainly the anonymous blocks and the triggers. And we saw together how the anonymous block works. And for anyone who's joining just today, we went through how you open the developer console and how you do execute anonymous. And we used most of our time, we were using this to execute our code or our classes, methods, and we saw how we can see the debug log for them and so how we can read it. The triggers is another category for the Apex invocation, and we saw together how we can write the trigger handler and how you can have a trigger on any object you want, custom or standard. And we saw the different 7 actions that you can be listening to from before and after insert, before and after update, before and after delete, and after undelete as well. So, and we saw together the best practices and how we can do the triggers in bulk and how you can do as well the trigger handlers and how to use the switch case when you are writing a trigger. So if anyone needs to refresh the triggers and how they were working, I would encourage you to check the videos we have here for the Apex invocation where we were talking specifically about the trigger and the trigger handler and how to write. Now, because we finished the beginner series and we are jumping into more advanced topics, so I split the topics or the different types of invocation type remaining that we didn't discuss in intermediate and advanced. So the intermediate topics that we'll be talking about will be the asynchronous Apex, and that's the topic we'll start talking about today. We'll start explaining the importance of the asynchronous Apex and how that's different from synchronous Apex. Also, we'll talk about invocable methods And invocable methods are very interesting because you can write Apex and you can call this Apex whether from a flow. If you are more into point and clicks and admin, you can still access or write an Apex and use it in a flow. We'll talk about how we can use it in Agentforce prompt builder and Agentforce actions as well. If you have an automated agent and you want to have an action to do an API call or to do something for you, how you can expose an Apex method and be able to use it and invoke it from the Agentforce actions as well. And the last thing is the email service. And the email service are very useful because they can, like, you can receive emails and you can invoke like or execute Apex on those emails. You can extract the details coming for you from the email and do certain actions. Uh, Not a lot of people use it, but it's good to know it. And it seems complicated, but we'll make it simple together in the sessions and try to explain how to use it and the syntax for it as well. So that's the three types I think, in my opinion, will be good for an intermediate level. And lastly will be the advanced level would be more how we can expose our Apex as web service, how we can enclose our logic as a web service and external system can consume it. So that will be part of like writing web services, and we'll see how the sessions will go, whether we'll go to the advanced topic um, right after the intermediate, or we can pause and continue the rest of the other topics I have that fit with the intermediate level series before moving to the advanced. So we'll assess the situation together and decide that. But that will include the web service. That's one part. The other big part will be how you can consume or execute Apex for a Visualforce page or a component or LWC component. And that's another decision we'll have to make together, whether we want to start with LWC directly or Visualforce page, or we want to skip all the advanced topics and continue with other intermediate topics as well. So that's a bit of a summary of the invocation types and how we are splitting them moving forward in our sessions. Any concerns, any questions anyone wants to share it with us before moving forward?
I think it's a good plan, Sally.
Okay, that's great. Okay. So today we got the big overview and we'll start talking what are the asynchronous Apex, and hopefully the time will permit and we'll start together as well the future method. But let's jump in and first understand what's the difference between synchronous Apex and asynchronous Apex. So for synchronous Apex, let's assume you have a process that is running or a method that is running. And this concept of differentiating between how the synchronous and asynchronous work, it's not just limited for Apex. It's any language, any programming language that supports synchronous and asynchronous. The idea will be the same. So if we have a process A and it's running, if we need to call process B, process A will be stopped. Like the execution here, it just stopped and we went to process B. And when we call process B, which can be another method or calling another system, an API, it does the logic and process A is waiting. We have to wait. We are not doing anything until we get a response back. And that's when process A continue. For example, like if you are in a website and you are buying something on the screen, like you click the items and you enter your credit card and your screen like show a loading page or please wait until payment is completed. That's type of synchronous because your page is frozen. The UI is waiting for the response from the payment that it got accepted or declined, for example. And then After we get the response from the payment, we get a message on the screen whether the payment is successful or it got denied. So that's the synchronous. The asynchronous, on the other hand, when we have a process A and when we are working through it and we want to call process B, process A continue working. Like it doesn't stop, it will continue. It just calls process B, and process B, whenever the resources are available or whenever it gets executed, it will be executed and the response will be sent back if there is any response that is required to be sent back. And sometimes as well, like it just, we send it and no response is coming back. That means in that case, let's say the payment was asynchronous. That means the user will hit pay and their screen will not be frozen and they will not be waiting for a response from the payment, and they can continue working. And in the case of the payment, that doesn't make sense. But for example, let's make it simpler as well. Like if you are cooking in the kitchen, if you have, for example, baking process and you have to follow step by step, and you cannot put the dough in the oven until you mix it very well. So that will be synchronous. You have to follow the steps one by one. Nothing can be done in parallel, and you cannot move to the next step before you finish the first one. And the asynchronous can be, for example, if you are cooking pasta and you are boiling the pasta, you can on the side have another pot to prepare the sauce. You don't have to wait for the pasta to be boiled to prepare the sauce for the pasta. So that's kind of like how you can think of it. Things can happen in parallel in asynchronous. You cannot control when the process B will be executed or when it will get a response. When it's synchronous, the UI will have to wait until we hear back from the other process before proceeding. So sometimes, or not sometimes, like during the beginner series, everything we did was synchronous. Like when we call a trigger and the trigger has, for example, to call a trigger handler, the trigger and trigger handler do the steps one by one. And if the trigger handler is calling multiple functions, they were called synchronously one. And after the first one is done, we can call the second and so on. So everything we did so far is synchronous, but today we want to start to do the asynchronous Apex. So to summarize, here we wait for each task to finish before starting the next. So process A, when sent to B, it waited for B to be completed before continuing. But in the asynchronous, we can start a task, then keep going while it finishes in the background. So process A can continue working while process B is doing the job for you. Why we need to learn about asynchronous and is there a need to use them? The answer is yes. There is a big need to use them, and you will find it like used. Some of the types of asynchronous Apex will be used more frequent than others, but in general, most of the projects I worked on needed asynchronous Apex. So asynchronous will let you run the code in a separate thread or like on the side. It's parallel. It doesn't have to be parallel, but with Salesforce, whenever the resources are available, the asynchronous code will be executed. So it will be a later time and it doesn't block the process. So it doesn't block the UI. So the user can continue working and their screen won't be frozen and then they can finish what they are working on. We call it sometimes when we talk about asynchronous, sometimes we call it, and sometimes people refer to it as fire and forget, that you fire a process or you start a process and forget about it. You don't wait for a response from this process to come back to you before finishing or continuing your work. Why we use it as well in Salesforce, that's because it can give you better, higher governor limits. Some of the governor limits, if you open the documentation, like so-called queries would be doubled. It will be 200 instead of 100. the heap size will be larger, and not just the limits are more, but let's say you have a transaction and you finished 50 of your 100 so-called queries. When you start an asynchronous Apex, it starts new limits, fresh limits. So this asynchronous Apex won't take into consideration that you consumed already 50. It will start for its own like code limits from zero again. So it gives you in some cases higher limits, but the more benefit for it that it has a separate limits from your current transaction that is working. And that sometimes can be handy when you find yourself hitting a limit and you need to run all the logic that you have or the trigger handler or the updates you are doing, but you are hitting a limit and you have no way to decrease these limits. So maybe you will decide, okay, what's the logic that I can move to an asynchronous Apex and have a higher limit for it so I can avoid hitting the limits for Salesforce. So that's one thing. Also, it improves system efficiency because sometimes some of the processes you can do sometimes takes longer. And if it takes longer, that means the user will be blocked. Like if you have a spinner on the screen and you hit sync to system B, like you have your record in Salesforce and you want to send your updates from Salesforce to an external system, but the user doesn't need or he doesn't care to wait to get the response, okay, that the other system received the updates or not. Like instead of hitting a button and the user wait on the screen, waiting for the spinner, running until the other system gets the update and reply back. Sometimes we choose in that case, okay, I won't block the user. I want to let the user work. And that's why I will fire something asynchronous that will run on the side. The user doesn't need to know when it's done or when it's executed, and the flow for the user continue without being blocked. So that's sometimes as well why we tend to use asynchronous Apex to give the user a better experience and to avoid a long wait and like waiting for a response that the user doesn't care about or calculations that takes longer to run and the user doesn't need for these calculations to be executed in order to continue their work. So that's the main two reasons why we sometimes tend to choose to go with asynchronous Apex. We have different types of asynchronous Apex in Salesforce. First of all is the future methods, and that's will be considered the easiest way to do asynchronous Apex. It has simple syntax. It's not very complicated to be implemented, and it can be used for simple tasks. And we learn some examples today when we talk about the future methods, when to use it. The other type, we have Queueable Apex. Queueable Apex wasn't there always, like at some point we never had it. And it's more advanced than the future methods, but it's more complex to implement. Not super complex. There is certain syntax and methods to implement in your class to be able to implement it because it implements certain interface and we learn it together and how to write it. But it's more powerful than the future methods. It allows chaining jobs, like you can call one from the other, like when the first one finish, it can call the next one. So you can have a sequence in your execution. And some limitations in the future methods were solved by the Queueable Apex, and we learn about them. Batch Apex, that's, I believe, in my experience, the most usable like asynchronous Apex that ever needed in the projects I worked in, because sometimes it's useful when you have very large data that you want to, for example, delete or update. the use cases where I needed. Sometimes we had, for example, an object that is exceeding or adding a lot of records, and it started to impact the storage of the org. For example, exception logs. We have sometimes we spoke about this briefly when you have logging. Sometimes you choose to have your custom object to enter your logs or your errors to be able to see it and not relying 100% on log files. So with the time, you keep adding records, and that will keep adding to your storage, which is not a very good idea because you can hit your storage limit and you don't care about the logs from 6 months ago, 3 months ago. So sometimes we try to run a batch job once per week to go through old records and delete them to free the storage and memory. And Apex batch is very important to do this along with the scheduled Apex as well. And scheduled Apex is when you want to schedule a certain logic or an Apex class to run in a certain time, monthly, weekly, or daily. It depends on your schedule. And it's good for the cleanup jobs, for the jobs that you want to run. And most probably, like when I have the batch class, I have a scheduler class for it as well. And we learn about them as well during the sessions. So that will be the first thing that we would want to tackle, the asynchronous Apex and their types and how to use them. The first type would be the future methods. Future methods, as we said, like it's the simplest of asynchronous types. So it's one type of the asynchronous Apex. It helps you run certain logic in a separate thread. Separate thread means like it doesn't block the user, it doesn't block the current process from running, and it runs whenever there is available resources for it to run. And we don't have control on when it's running. Like you cannot guarantee it will run in the next minute or the next second, or it will take 10 minutes to run. It depends on the resources that Salesforce allocate, and whenever they are available, they will run. We use future method, or the most common use cases for them will be to solve something called mixed DML errors. And the solution that we usually tend to do is using future method when we hit them. And today I will try to show you a mixed DML error syntax and how it will behave when we try to execute it in execute anonymous. And then we'll try to use the future methods and see how that will fix it for us. The other thing or other use case that most people use future method for is making callouts from triggers. Callout it means like an external system like Google APIs or another API that is available for the public, or that you need to subscribe and pay for it, but it's an API that another system give it to you and expose to you, and you call it to do certain things. Like, for example, Google APIs, you can give 2 zip codes and it tells you the distance between them or the duration to travel from this zip code to another zip code. So that's what is call out, is whenever we are calling an external API from Salesforce. Salesforce has a limitation. If you try to run or execute a callout from triggers, it will give you an exception and it will block it. You are not able to do a callout from the trigger. And the reason for that you don't want you to be blocking the trigger, waiting for an external system or another process to run and send you the response. So they block this from triggers. So the solution, if there is a need or use case where you need to do a callout in a trigger, it will be also using future methods. And we'll try to see today as well, depending on the time, if we have the time to do the callout too or not. but we'll see today or next session how it will be blocked from the triggers and how using the future method will help you execute it with no issues. It's very simple, and we'll see it today together. What's the syntax for it? So we are used about, like, if I show you this syntax, it will it will sound very familiar. Like you have a public, you have here a method signature where you have a public static method, void, it doesn't return anything. Then we have a method name, and we have a parameter in the curly brackets to do the logic. The only thing that is new for us today is the annotation that we have here, the add feature. And that's the syntax or the main syntax that differentiate the normal method versus a future method, that you have the annotation add feature. So that's very important when you want a method to be a future method, add the annotation add feature above it. That will tell Salesforce this is a future method, won't block the process, it will be executed in a different thread whenever we have the resources for it. But because it's a future method, yes, it looks like normal method signature, but we have specific conditions or rules we have to follow. It has to be static. That's something, it's a must. You cannot create a future method without static. It has to have void return type. It cannot return integer or a string. And it should take primitive data types. It cannot take, for example, an S object, or it cannot take a custom defined object. So let me show you quickly here. If we open, let's create a new class, test future method. So if you try here, we said it's at future, sorry, to say it's a future method, we said it's public static void test future method. And here we say string or ID, record ID. So if I try to save it, it won't give me an error. But if you remove the static, it should give us an error here. It says future method must be declared as static. So it's not an option not to have it static. Same if I say return, Boolean. If I want to return Boolean and say here, return Boolean, return true, and try to save, we'll get another error message here saying future method does not support return type Boolean. So it has to be void. And the last thing is the parameters. So if, for example, I have here record ID, it doesn't complain about it. But if I have here, I think we have a class cat object. If I try to save it, it tells me future method doesn't support parameter type of cat. So the types should be the primitive data types that we learned together in the beginner series. And sometimes people wonder, like, why I should pass the record ID, for example, and not an account. Like, I cannot pass account as well, as objects won't be allowed. The reason why you cannot pass an account, for example, the way we are doing it, it doesn't support account. The reason why it doesn't support it, because as we said, we cannot guarantee when the future method will be executed. It can take 5 minutes, it can take 2 seconds to be executed. Whenever the resources are available, it will be executed. So if we pass an account, and let's say we have the name and industry defined, And between the time the future method will be executed and the time we called it, that account got changed, or the industry for this account got changed, the value we'll have here will be the old value, and it will cause issues. So that's why Salesforce is not allowing us to pass as objects. You have to pass, for example, a record ID, and then you can do your SOAP here and call it and use it. The other thing that we want to know, like if you want to execute a future method, it's the same like as executing regular methods. You will have to use the class name because it's a static method. So class name dot the method name, and you pass here the record ID. So you pass the value or the parameter you have here. If it's, for example, a string name value, and I can pass here, for example, Sally, and let's print it as well here. System.debug and name, and I will do it like that. Name value and save. If I execute it now, it will be executed. But if I open here the debug, the logs as well, I want to show you, you'll find that there is an operation now called future handler, because the debugging that we have here is in a future method. So it has a future handler executed. If I remove this one and you try to execute it, you'll find that it's not a future handler anymore. It's a normal execution, execute anonymous, and that's it. It has the same debug method, debug statement, and it will be printed, but it's not a future handler anymore. Future handler happens when we have the future, because as we said, like it's not blocking the process, which is the execute anonymous, where we are executing our code in that case. And it just another thread. So another execution will happen for the future handler whenever the resources are available. So if you notice, the logic or the syntax for it is very simple. You just add the add feature annotation, follow the rules that it's static, it's void, the parameters you're passing are primitive data type, and the way you call it is the same. You are calling a static method the same way as it's not future method, by calling the class name dot the method name, and you call it. So that's why we consider the future. If you remember in the slide at the beginning, I mentioned that the future method is one of the simplest ways to do an asynchronous Apex. If you're new to the asynchronous word and how to execute it, it's very simple. It's just a method with this annotation. Let's see together. We said one of the usage we want to discuss or to see together is mixed DML operation, and how the future execution, the future method can fix it or help us fix it. So to understand first, what's the mixed DML error? So it happens when you try to update a setup object. Some of the objects we consider setup object are like user, permission set assignment, and there is here, let me share this link with you. This is a Salesforce documentation. It tells you what are the S objects that they cannot be mixed with regular records or DMLs for other records. So it will give you object permission, permission set, QS object, territory, user. So there is some objects that are considered setup. And the reason why, I believe, because most of them, they impact how what the user can see, or the records and what you can see. So the permissions, object permission, permission set assignment. So it can cause an issue, and that's why Salesforce is stopping you from updating them along with updating regular objects as well. So it happens when you try to update or one of those setup objects with non-setup objects like account, contact, custom object in the same transaction, means in the same thread or the same start to end, like when you are executing your code. What will happen is an error, as the screenshot here, can tell you like you have mixed DML operation and on setup object, and it's not permitted with non-setup object and vice versa. And it tells you like I was trying here in this example, doing something with the user and the account. So I can show you an example for it. Open resource, yeah, I have it here. So here I'm having a class. I created a class. I created a static method. Here in the static method, I'm trying to create an account, and I'm calling a method to insert a certain user, to create me a user. I'm passing a username, the alias I want, and the email I want, and the last name. And I'm calling it within the same method here. So that's why it's considered the same transaction, because we'll be calling do mixed DML. And in the insert user with role, what we are doing is that we're getting standard user profile and a role, because this issue will happen specifically when you have a role for the user. And I will try to create a new user, setting the username, the alias, last name, the language, local, the profile, the role ID, and everything. And then we are trying to insert. So as simple as I'm creating an account and a user in the same transaction. So if I open the execute anonymous now, and let me remove this, and I try to do mixed DML error demo dot do mixed DML. So I will call this method and I will try to execute. When I called it, we got the error that we saw in the screenshot, that I have mixed DML operation and we cannot do it. And in real life, like when you are working, sometimes you forget which objects can do this issue for you, and you tend to have this issue out of nowhere and you don't know what to do. So it's as simple as using future method. You remove one of them to be in a future method, and that will solve it for you. So let me remove here, clear the logs, and I will try here. This is a static method, so it's static already. It's void. It's not returning a user. And all the parameters are strings, so primitive data type. So all we need to do is make it with a future annotation. If I do that now with add future, and I try to execute it again, you'll find that we won't get the error anymore. And we have here the future handler. I got an error in the future handler because this is a like my org for developer org, and I don't have licenses enough to create a new user. So that's why we got license limit exceeded, but it didn't complain about running or creating the user as we had without the future, add future. And we have here a future handler, which showed to you that it tried to get executed in a different thread. So that's the use case we have here. And just to explain it more to you, like some objects like user, role, permission, control access and permissions in your org. So Salesforce, when we update those records, like one of those, like user, role, permissions, with other data, it can cause the issue that we saw together, the mixed DML. And Salesforce block it and prevent it because it doesn't want to have the two types of records, like data records and setup objects updated in the same transaction. So to fix it, we need to run one of them in a separate transaction, in a separate thread, and that's what we did now with the future method. Just something I found interesting, like this permission mixed DML will appear only when you are trying to do insert and update. But if you try to delete between set of objects and data objects together in the same transaction, it's allowed. So it happens only when you have insert and update or update. So the other type, I think it would be a bit stretch to cover it in 15 minutes, but just to give you an idea, and we'll see how it goes. But the other thing is having a problem executing a call out from a trigger. And that's what's a trigger call out is whenever you try to call an external API, like do an HTTP call out directly from a trigger. Salesforce as well, like for example, I have here prepared an example, an API. There is a very nice colleague called Walid Al-Hor. He replied to my post asking for nice APIs, easy APIs to call. So we'll be working with this API from one of the resources he pointed out to me. It's just an API to get you details about the country by the name or can get you all the countries. So if you try to execute this API from a trigger, you will get an exception like this one. Callout from triggers are currently not supported. So you cannot make an API call and do a callout from a trigger. So let's take this time to see the API and how you can try it in Postman. And maybe next time we'll see it in the trigger and see the Apex code for it and how it can be fixed for the future. So that was the API, one of the APIs that Walid Al-Hor mentioned to me. I was looking for APIs that are free of charge, that we don't have to pay for it, so we can all of us play with it and use it. And if you guys have any other APIs that you used and it's interesting and it does something nice, please send it to me because in this series, we won't be covering the syntax of doing a call out in depth, but we'll get an idea about it and how to use it. And so I want to have different examples, so your help is really appreciated. So this REST API, what it does is we can call it with this endpoint. Endpoint is the address or the URL that you have to execute in Salesforce to get the response. It doesn't take any parameters, and it can return for us the country and details about it. Or we can get a specific country by passing this endpoint and at the end appending to it a country name, and it will return for us this response. Another version of it, how to get me all the countries for a specific language, for example, English, French, and it can get you the list of the countries. So just let's see if it's working. Sometimes it's working, sometimes it's not. Again, it's free, so we cannot complain as much. But let's say here I have passed France. If I hit send, okay, it's not working now. Let's try to hit it again. Okay, so it's returned for me what's the name of the country, which is France. What's the official name for it? Like some details. It's independent, capital, Paris. What's the region? It's Europe. The language French, the translation for the name for it in different language. So for Arabic, that's the Arabic name. So it gives me the details of this country. What's the flag and the URL for its Google Maps. And the same for if we want to hit the all countries, and it gives us all the results, all the countries. I created a Postman collection. I exported it and I will put it on GitHub for you. You can use it. You will find that it has get all countries, get by name, get by language. You can play with it and see. Sometimes it doesn't work, but if I try again, it works. To import it, you will have either Postman on the web or download the Postman, and you will hit import, and you will have to drag the JSON file that I have for you. You have a question, right, Connor?
Yeah, Sally. So, now this in the trigger, are you still running a future?
Yes, we'll see it. Let me show you how it will behave. And I don't think the time will permit to go through it in details, but like I created here in my org um, a, um, a sample to go through it. And I prepared trigger for you, country trigger, that will call a country trigger handler. And in the country trigger handler, I can call a method that will update the countries, and it calls um, the API one by one for each country and update it. If I don't have the add feature, it will cause an issue and it won't be called. But let's say I have it here, and let me save to deploy. If I create, for example, here, and create a new country, let's say I will use Egypt as the country that I want to use. And I have here the debug. I will clear it for you so you can see. And I will hit save. When I hit save, like the capital region flag, everything is empty because that's something is coming from the API. But it does do a future handler as well. Future handler, it will do the call out and will call this same API. If I go and refresh now, that hit the endpoint, got me the details for Egypt, and it got me that the capital is Cairo, it's in Africa, this is the flag, and this is the map. I can click on it and show to me where Egypt is in Google Maps. So that's just an example. Let's say if I remove the future, the same method is there for the trigger handler. And let me save. And I will try to do another country. Here, Kuwait. And I will try to hit it. You'll see here, it's still not did any future handler. It's not there. And most probably here, it give an exception. Debug. Okay, yeah. So it tells me callout from trigger are currently not supported because I removed the future. Because this method here, we didn't go through the syntax for it because this is not the focus of this session. This does an API call, and I can share the logic for it if anyone wants to go through it, or we can go through it quickly. But here, this one is doing an API call. So that's why we got callout from trigger are currently not supported. If I remove and allow add feature and deploy, and I will try the same, like let's delete this one. I did the logic to run on insert only, not the update for simplicity. But let's say I try now and hit save. I go to the debug. Yeah, I will wait for the future handler. All of that, the future handler didn't appear. That means it didn't get executed yet. And yes, here we go. Like now I got, but here it gave me an exception that it's timeout. Timeout, that's an error coming from the API. Again, it's a public API. So sometimes it works, sometimes not. If I do Canada, for example, and I refresh, not yet. So waiting for the future handler for it. I tried to execute it, and let's see if we got the results back. So it gave me that what's the capital, the region, the flag, the map for it. So again, this is maybe it doesn't make sense. Why do you have a country object? But again, it's just an example to show you that without the future, and you will notice something as well, like we used to do add future here because we are doing a call out as well. We did an extra parameter here that we are allowing the future method to have call out. Call out means to execute or run an external API. So we did here call out equal true to allow it. So that's the main syntax to run it and to see that you can execute an API call out from trigger only if you have the add feature call out equal true.
So you made the call to the system.
Mhm.
And so is this transaction active until you get the request? Or
No, like
like it,
whenever we call a future with call out or not call out, here the trigger will do this. The trigger will call the trigger handler call this future method. It will be executed and the transaction will be terminated. And this will take its own time. Like as you saw, like we had to refresh the record and we had to wait for the future handler in the debug statement, in the debug log to know that the future method got executed. So this will be like as if in a queue, whenever there is the resources, it will be executed. But it won't block our trigger. Our trigger or the transaction of the trigger will be ended. No problem. This will take its turn to run whenever the resources are available.
okay, but in your example, it failed from the system, from the external system. We didn't
Yes.
get a response.
Yes.
So I guess what I'm trying to understand is that once you kick this off, it had its own transaction,
Yes.
and then the transaction failed because the external system did not respond.
Yes. It timed out because we have, if I open this one here, I believe I have set it up to be 10 seconds and to time out after.
Okay.
So it timed out after 10 seconds. We can go up to 120,000 milliseconds, which is 2 minutes. So we can go
Okay.
up to 2 minutes waiting, but like here, I just limited to 10 because I know when I was testing it, it whether go fast or it whether fail fast. Right. Because again, it's
Okay.
not a very stable API, but it's something free that we can play with.
Yeah.
Do you guys wish to have like to go and explain the logic, how we implemented it, this example for the trigger in depth? Do you want to go through
Well,
this next time?
yeah, I mean, I would like to, have you step through that and explain
Okay.
it. That would be great.
Yes. Okay.
We don't have to do it right now, but
Yes, we can do it
yeah.
next time. I can go through the logic for it. Like I will start from the trigger, the object we have. I will show you the API here and explain that we have a JSON, how we converted the response into the JSON. We can go through this next time. It just give you an idea, to give you a whole picture about the future method. Like these are two use cases that people tends to use future method with them to solve the issue, mixed DML operation in making callout from the trigger. But next time, we'll start again from the trigger callout, and we'll go through the process and how the logic is written step by step in depth. And we will try to explain it as much as we can, but keep in mind that the callout and Apex callout will be covered in another section when we talk about integration in more depth. Here we'll see only the get, how to get information, but we won't be able to see post and other methods of the callouts that we can do, like to update or to create records somewhere else. But we'll see the get together in more depth. We'll talk about the trigger handler, how we did the callout, and explain that logic. And we'll continue with the future method to summarize the use cases for them and the considerations or the limitations that the future method present, and why people sometimes tend to use the Queueable Apex instead. Thank you so much for listening. I hope today was useful. Next time, we'll do again the trigger callout, and we'll take our time discussing them in depth more and answer any questions you have. And we'll finish the future methods. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next week.